The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, an Empirical Investigation. By Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James A. Robinson. First published in the American Economic Review, December 2001. Introduction. We exploit differences in European mortality rates to estimate the effect of institutions on economic performance. Europeans adopted very different colonization policies in different colonies, with different associated institutions. In places where Europeans faced high mortality rates, they could not settle and were more likely to set up extractive institutions. These institutions persisted to the present. Exploiting differences in European mortality rates as an instrument for current institutions, we estimate large effects of institutions on income per capita. Once the effect of institutions is controlled for, countries in Africa or those closer to the equator do not have lower incomes. What are the fundamental causes of the large differences in income per capita across countries? Although there is still little consensus on the answer to this question, differences in institutions and property rights have received considerable attention in recent years. Countries with better institutions, more secure property rights, and less distortionary policies will invest more in physical and human capital, and will use these factors more efficiently to achieve a greater level of income. This view receives some support from cross-country correlations between measures of property rights and economic development, and from a few micro-studies that investigate the relationship between property rights and investment or output. At some level, it is obvious that institutions matter. Witness, for example, the divergent paths of North and South Korea, or East and West Germany, where one part of the country stagnated under central planning and collective ownership, while the other prospered with private property and a market economy. Nevertheless, we lack reliable estimates of the effect of institutions on economic performance. It is quite likely that rich economies choose or can afford better institutions. Perhaps more important, economies that are different for a variety of reasons will differ both in their institutions and in their income per capita. To estimate the impact of institutions on economic performance, we need a source of exogenous variation in institutions. In this paper, we propose a theory of institutional differences among countries colonized by Europeans, and exploit this theory to derive a possible source of exogenous variation. Our theory rests on three premises. Premise 1. There were different types of colonization policies which created different sets of institutions. At one extreme, European powers set up extractive states, exemplified by the Belgian colonization of the Congo. These institutions did not introduce much protection for private property, nor did they provide checks and balances against government expropriation. In fact, the main purpose of the extractive state was to transfer as much of the resources of the colony to the colonizer. At the other extreme, many Europeans migrated and settled in a number of colonies, creating what the historian Alfred Crosby calls neo-Europes. The settlers tried to replicate European institutions, with strong emphasis on private property and checks against government power. Primary examples of this include Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. Premise 2. The colonization strategy was influenced by the feasibility of settlements. In places where the disease environment was not favorable to European settlement, the cards were stacked against the creation of neo-Europes, and the formation of the extractive state was more likely. Premise 3. The colonial state and institutions persisted even after independence. Based on these three premises, we use the mortality rates expected by the first European settlers in the colonies as an instrument for current institutions in these countries. More specifically, our theory can be schematically summarized as: potential settler mortality leads to settlements, that lead to early institutions, that lead to current institutions, that lead to current performance. We use data on the mortality rates of soldiers, bishops, and sailors stationed in the colonies between the 17th and 19th centuries, largely based on the work of the historian Philip D. Curtin. These give a good indication of the mortality rates faced by settlers. Europeans were well informed about these mortality rates at the time, even though they did not know how to control the diseases that cause these high mortality rates. Figure 1 plots the logarithm of GDP per capita today against the logarithm of the settler mortality rates per thousand for a sample of 75 countries. It shows a strong negative relationship. Colonies where Europeans faced higher mortality rates are today substantially poorer than colonies that were healthy for Europeans. Our theory is that this relationship reflects the effect of settler mortality working through the institutions brought by Europeans. To substantiate this, we regress current performance on current institutions, and instrument the latter by settler mortality rates. Since our focus is on property rights and checks against government power, we use the Protection Against Risk of Expropriation Index from Political Risk Services as a proxy for institutions. This variable measures differences in institutions originating from different types of states and state policies. There is a strong first-stage relationship between settler mortality rates and current institutions, which is interesting in its own right. The regression shows that mortality rates faced by the settlers more than 100 years ago explains over 25% of the variation in current institutions. We also document that this relationship works through the channels we hypothesize. Potential settler mortality rates were a major determinant of settlements. Settlements were a major determinant of early institutions, in practice, institutions in 1900, and there is a strong correlation between early institutions and institutions today. Our two-stage least squares estimate of the effect of institutions on performance is relatively precisely estimated and large. For example, it implies that improving Nigeria's institutions to the level of Chile could, in the long run, lead to as much as a 7-fold increase in Nigeria's income. In practice, Chile is over 11 times as rich as Nigeria. The exclusion restriction implied by our instrumental variable regression is that, conditional on the controls included in the regression, the mortality rates of European settlers more than 100 years ago have no effect on GDP per capita today, other than their effect through institutional development. The major concern with this exclusion restriction is that the mortality rates of settlers could be correlated with the current disease environment, which may have a direct effect on economic performance. In this case, our instrumental variables estimates may be assigning the effect of diseases on income to institutions. We believe that this is unlikely to be the case and that our exclusion restriction is plausible. The great majority of European deaths in the colonies were caused by malaria and yellow fever. Although these diseases were fatal to Europeans who had no immunity, they had limited effect on indigenous adults who had developed various types of immunities. These diseases are therefore unlikely to be the reason why many countries in Africa and Asia are very poor today. This notion is supported by the mortality rates of local people in these areas. For example, Curtin reports that the annual mortality rates of local troops serving with the British Army in Bengal and Madras were respectively 11 and 13 in 1,000. These numbers are quite comparable to, in fact, lower than, the annual mortality rates of British troops serving in Britain, which were approximately 15 in 1,000. In contrast, the mortality rates of British troops serving in these colonies were much higher because of their lack of immunity. For example, mortality rates in Bengal and Madras for British troops were between 70 and 170 in 1,000. The view that the disease burden for indigenous adults was not unusual in places like Africa or India is also supported by the relatively high population densities in these places before Europeans arrived. We document that our estimates of the effect of institutions on performance are not driven by outliers. For example, excluding Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States does not change the results, nor does excluding Africa. Interestingly, we show that once the effect of institutions on economic performance is controlled for, neither distance from the equator nor the dummy for Africa is significant. These results suggest that Africa is poorer than the rest of the world not because of pure geographic or cultural factors, but because of worse institutions. The validity of our approach, that is, our exclusion restriction, is threatened if other factors correlated with the estimates of settler mortality affect income per capita. We adopt two strategies to substantiate that our results are not driven by omitted factors. First, we investigate whether institutions have a comparable effect on income once we control for a number of variables potentially correlated with settler mortality and economic outcomes. We find that none of these overturns our results. The estimates change remarkably little when we include controls for the identity of the main colonizer, legal origin, climate, religion, geography, natural resources, soil quality, and measures of ethnolinguistic fragmentation. Furthermore, the results are also robust to the inclusion of controls for the current disease environment, for example, the prevalence of malaria, life expectancy, and infant mortality, and the current fraction of the population of European descent. Naturally, it is impossible to control for all possible variables that might be correlated with settler mortality and economic outcomes. Furthermore, our empirical approach might capture the effect of settler mortality on economic performance, but working through other channels. We deal with these problems by using a simple over-identification test using measures of European migration to the colonies and early institutions as additional instruments. We then use over-identification tests to detect whether settler mortality has a direct effect on current performance. The results are encouraging for our approach. They generate no evidence for a direct effect of settler mortality on economic outcomes. We are not aware of others who have pointed out the link between settler mortality and institutions, though scholars such as William H. McNeill in 1976, Crosby in 1986, and Jared M. Diamond in 1997, have discussed the influence of diseases on human history. Diamond, in particular, emphasizes comparative development, but his theory is based on the geographical determinants of the incidence of the Neolithic Revolution. He ignores both the importance of institutions and the potential causes of divergence in more recent development, which are the main focus of our paper. Work by Ronald E. Robinson and John Gallagher, Louis H. Gann and Peter Degnan, Donald D. Noon, and Philip J. Kane and Anthony G. Hopkins emphasizes that settler colonies such as the United States and New Zealand are different from other colonies, and point out that these differences were important for their economic success. Nevertheless, this literature does not develop the link between mortality, settlements, and institutions. Our argument is most closely related to work on the influence of colonial experience on institutions. Friedrich von Hayek argued that the British common law tradition was superior to the French civil law, which was developed during the Napoleonic era to restrain judges' interference with state policies. More recently, Raphael Laporta et al. Emphasized the importance of colonial origin, that is, the identity of the colonizer, and legal origin on current institutions, and show that the common law countries and former British colonies have better property rights and more developed financial markets. Similarly, David Landis and North et al. Argue that former British colonies prospered relative to former French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonies because of the good economic and political institutions and culture they inherited from Britain. In contrast to this approach, which focuses on the identity of the colonizer, we emphasize the conditions in the colonies. Specifically, in our theory, and in the data, it is not the identity of the colonizer or legal origin that matters, but whether European colonialists could safely settle in a particular location. Where they could not settle, they created worse institutions. In this respect, our argument is closely related to that of Stanley L. Engerman and Kenneth L. Sokoloff, who also emphasize institutions, but link them to factor endowments and inequality. Empirically, our work is related to a number of other attempts to uncover the link between institutions and development, as well as to Graziella Bertocchi and Fabio Canova and Robin M. Greer, who investigate the effect of being a colony on post-war growth. Two papers deal with the endogeneity of institutions by using an instrumental variables approach as we do here. Morrow instruments for corruption using ethnolinguistic fragmentation. Hall and Jones, in turn, use distance from the equator as an instrument for social infrastructure because, they argue, latitude is correlated with Western influence, which leads to good institutions. The theoretical reasoning for these instruments is not entirely convincing. It is not easy to argue that the Belgian influence in the Congo, or Western influence in the Gold Coast during the era of slavery promoted good institutions. Ethnolinguistic fragmentation, on the other hand, seems endogenous, especially since such fragmentation almost completely disappeared in Europe during the era of growth when a centralized state and market emerged. Econometrically, the problem with both studies is that their instruments can plausibly have a direct effect on performance. For example, William Easterly and Ross Levine argue that ethnolinguistic fragmentation can affect performance by creating political instability, while Charles de Montesquieu and more recently David E. Bloom and Jeffrey D. Sachs and John Gallup et al. Argue for a direct effect of climate on performance. If, indeed, these variables have a direct effect, they are invalid instruments and do not establish that it is institutions that matter. The advantage of our approach is that conditional on the variables we already control for, settler mortality more than 100 years ago should have no effect on output today, other than through its effect on institutions. Interestingly, our results show that distance from the equator does not have an independent effect on economic performance, validating the use of this variable as an instrument in the work by Hall and Jones. The next section outlines our hypothesis and provides supporting historical evidence. Section 2 presents OLS regressions of GDP per capita on our index of institutions. Section 3 describes our key instrument for institutions, the mortality rates faced by potential settlers at the time of colonization. Section 4 presents our main results. Section 5 investigates the robustness of our results, and Section 6 concludes. Section 1. The hypothesis and historical background. We hypothesized that settler mortality affected settlements. Settlements affected early institutions, and early institutions persisted and formed the basis of current institutions. In this section, we discuss and substantiate this hypothesis. The next subsection discusses the link between mortality rates of settlers and settlement decisions. Then we discuss differences in colonization policies, and finally, we turn to the causes of institutional persistence. Subsection A. Mortality and settlements. There is little doubt that mortality rates were a key determinant of European settlements. Curtin documents how both the British and French press informed the public of mortality rates in the colonies. Curtin, 1964, also documents how early British expectations for settlement in West Africa were dashed by very high mortality among early settlers, about half of whom could be expected to die in the first year. In The Province of Freedom, Sierra Leone, European mortality in the first year was 46%. In Bulama 1793 there was 61% mortality among Europeans. In the first year of the Sierra Leone Company, 1792 to 1793, 72% of the European settlers died. On Mungo Park's second expedition in May to November 1805, 87% of Europeans died during the overland trip from Gambia to the Niger, and all the Europeans died before completing the expedition. An interesting example of the awareness of the disease environment comes from the Pilgrim Fathers. They decided to migrate to the United States rather than Guyana because of the high mortality rates in Guyana. Another example comes from the Beecham Committee in 1795, set up to decide where to send British convicts who had previously been sent to the United States. One of the leading proposals was the island of Lemaine, up the Gambia River. The committee rejected this possibility because they decided mortality rates would be too high even for the convicts. Southwest Africa was also rejected for health reasons. The final decision was to send convicts to Australia. The eventual expansion of many of the colonies was also related to the living conditions there. In places where the early settlers faced high mortality rates, there would be less incentive for new settlers to come. Subsection B: Types of colonization and settlements. The historical evidence supports both the notion that there was a wide range of different types of colonization and that the presence or absence of European settlers was a key determinant of the form colonialism took. Historians, including Robinson and Gallagher, Gann and Dignan, D. Noon, and Kane and Hopkins, have documented the development of settler colonies, where Europeans settled in large numbers, and life was modeled after the home country. D. Noon emphasizes that settler colonies had representative institutions which promoted what the settlers wanted and that what they wanted was freedom and the ability to get rich by engaging in trade. He argues that there was undeniably something capitalist in the structure of these colonies. Private ownership of land and livestock was well established very early. When the establishment of European-like institutions did not arise naturally, the settlers were ready to fight for them against the wishes of the home country. Australia is an interesting example here. Most of the early settlers in Australia were ex-convicts, but the land was owned largely by ex-jailers, and there was no legal protection against the arbitrary power of landowners. The settlers wanted institutions and political rights like those prevailing in England at the time. They demanded jury trials, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and electoral representation. Although the British government resisted at first, the settlers argued that they were British and deserved the same rights as in the home country. Kane and Hopkins write from the late 1840s the British bowed to local pressures and, in line with observed constitutional changes taking place in Britain herself, accepted the idea that, in mature colonies, governors should in future form ministries from the majority elements in elected legislatures. They also suggest that the enormous boom in public investment after 1870 in New Zealand was an attempt to build up an infrastructure to maintain high living standards in a country where voters expected politicians actively to promote their economic welfare. This is in sharp contrast to the colonial experience in Latin America during the 17th and 18th centuries, and in Asia and Africa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The main objective of the Spanish and the Portuguese colonization was to obtain gold and other valuables from America. Soon after the conquest, the Spanish crown granted rights to land and labor, the encomienda, and set up a complex mercantilist system of monopolies and trade regulations to extract resources from the colonies. Europeans developed the slave trade in Africa for similar reasons. Before the mid-19th century, colonial powers were mostly restricted to the African coast and concentrated on monopolizing trade in slaves, gold, and other valuable commodities. Witness the names used to describe West African countries: the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast. Thereafter, colonial policy was driven in part by an element of superpower rivalry, but mostly by economic motives. Michael Crowder, for example, notes it is significant that Britain's largest colony on the west coast, nowadays Nigeria, should have been the one where her traders were most active, and bears out the contention that, for Britain, flag followed trade. Lance Davis and Robert Huttenbeck conclude that the colonial empire provides strong evidence for the belief that government was attuned to the interests of business and willing to divert resources to ends that the business community would have found profitable. They find that before 1885 investment in the British Empire had a return 25% higher than that on domestic investment, though afterwards the two converged. Andrew Roberts writes, from 1930 to 1940 Britain had kept for itself £2,400,000 in taxes from the Copper Belt, while Northern Rhodesia received from Britain only £136,000 in grants for development. Similarly, Patrick Manning estimates that between 1905 and 1914, 50% of GDP in Dahomey was extracted by the French, and Crawford Young notes that tax rates in Tunisia were 4 times as high as in France. Probably the most extreme case of extraction was that of King Leopold of Belgium in the Congo. Gan and Dignan argue that following the example of the Dutch in Indonesia, Leopold's philosophy was that the colonies should be exploited, not by the operation of a market economy, but by state intervention and compulsory cultivation of cash crops to be sold to and distributed by the state at controlled prices. Jean-Philippe Piemans calculates that tax rates on Africans in the Congo approached 60% of their income during the 1920s and 1930s. Bogumil Juziwicki writes that during the period when Leopold was directly in charge, policy was based on the violent exploitation of natural and human resources, with a consequent destruction of economic and social life and dismemberment of political structures. Overall, there were few constraints on state power in the non-settler colonies. The colonial powers set up authoritarian and absolutist states with the purpose of solidifying their control and facilitating the extraction of resources. Young quotes a French official in Africa: "The European commandant is not posted to observe nature, he has a mission to impose regulations, to limit individual liberties, to collect taxes." Manning summarizes this as, "In Europe, the theories of representative democracy won out over the theorists of absolutism. But in Africa, the European conquerors set up absolutist governments, based on reasoning similar to that of Louis XIV. Subsection C. Institutional persistence. There is a variety of historical evidence, as well as our regressions in Table 3 below, suggesting that the control structures set up in the non-settler colonies during the colonial era persisted, while there is little doubt that the institutions of law and order and private property established during the early phases of colonialism in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, Hong Kong, and Singapore have formed the basis of the current-day institutions of these countries. Young emphasizes that the extractive institutions set up by the colonialists persisted long after the colonial regime ended. He writes, "Although we commonly describe the independent polities as new states, in reality they were successors to the colonial regime, inheriting its structures, its quotidian routines and practices, and its more hidden normative theories of governance." An example of the persistence of extractive state institutions into the independence era is provided by the persistence of the most prominent extractive policies. In Latin America, the full panoply of monopolies and regulations, which had been created by Spain, remained intact after independence, for most of the 19th century. Forced labor policies persisted and were even intensified or reintroduced with the expansion of export agriculture in the latter part of the 19th century. Slavery persisted in Brazil until 1886, and during the sisal boom in Mexico, forced labor was reintroduced and persisted up to the start of the revolution in 1910. Forced labor was also reintroduced in Guatemala and El Salvador to provide labor for coffee growing. In the Guatemalan case, forced labor lasted until the creation of democracy in 1945. Similarly, forced labor was reinstated in many independent African countries, for example, by Mobutu in Zaire. There are a number of economic mechanisms that will lead to institutional persistence of this type. Here, we discuss three possibilities. Possibility 1. Setting up institutions that place restrictions on government power and enforce property rights is costly. If the costs of creating these institutions have been sunk by the colonial powers, then it may not pay the elites at independence to switch to extractive institutions. In contrast, when the new elites inherit extractive institutions, they may not want to incur the costs of introducing better institutions, and may instead prefer to exploit the existing extractive institutions for their own benefits. Possibility 2. The gains to an extractive strategy may depend on the size of the ruling elite. When this elite is small, each member would have a larger share of the revenues, so the elite may have a greater incentive to be extractive. In many cases where European powers set up authoritarian institutions, they delegated the day-to-day running of the state to a small domestic elite. This narrow group often was the one to control the state after independence and favored extractive institutions. Possibility 3. If agents make irreversible investments that are complementary to a particular set of institutions, they will be more willing to support them, making these institutions persist. For example, agents who have invested in human and physical capital will be in favor of spending money to enforce property rights, while those who have less to lose may not be. Section 2. Institutions and Performance, OLS Estimates. Subsection A. Data and Descriptive Statistics. Table 1 provides descriptive statistics for the key variables of interest. The first column is for the whole world, and column 2 is for our base sample, limited to the 64 countries that were ex-colonies and for which we have settler mortality, protection against expropriation risk, and GDP data. This is smaller than the sample in Figure 1. The GDP per capita in 1995 is PPP adjusted. Income, GDP, per capita will be our measure of economic outcome. There are large differences in income per capita in both the world sample and our basic sample, and the standard deviation of log income per capita in both cases is 1.1. In row 3, we also give output per worker in 1988 from Hall and Jones as an alternative measure of income today. Hall and Jones prefer this measure since it explicitly refers to worker productivity. On the other hand, given the difficulty of measuring the formal labor force, it may be a noisier measure of economic performance than income per capita. We use a variety of variables to capture institutional differences. Our main variable, reported in the second row, is an index of protection against expropriation. These data are from Political Risk Services, and were first used in the economics and political science literatures by Knack and Kiefer. Political Risk Services reports a value between 0 and 10 for each country and year, with 0 corresponding to the lowest protection against expropriation. We use the average value for each country between 1985 and 1995. Values are missing for many countries before 1985. This measure is appropriate for our purposes since the focus here is on differences in institutions originating from different types of states and state policies. We expect our notion of extractive state to correspond to a low value of this index, while the tradition of rule of law and well-enforced property rights should correspond to high values. The next row gives an alternative measure, constraints on the executive in 1990, coded from the Polity 3 dataset of Ted Robert Gurr and Associates. Results using the constraints on the executive and other measures are reported in the paper made in 2000 and are not repeated here. The next 3 rows give measures of early institutions from the same Gurr dataset. The first is a measure of constraints on the executive in 1900 and the second is an index of democracy in 1900. This information is not available for countries that were still colonies in 1900, so we assign these countries the lowest possible score. In the following row, we report the mean and standard deviation of constraints on the executive in the first year of independence, that is, the first year a country enters the Gurr dataset, as an alternative measure of institutions. The second to last row gives the fraction of the population of European descent in 1900, which is our measure of European settlement in the colonies, constructed from McAvity and Jones and Curtin et al. The final row gives the logarithm of the baseline settler mortality estimates. The remaining columns give descriptive statistics for groups of countries at different quartiles of the settler mortality distribution. This is useful since settler mortality is our instrument for institutions. This variable is described in more detail in the next section. Subsection B. Ordinary least squares regressions. Table 2 reports ordinary least squares, OLS, regressions of log per capita income on the protection against expropriation variable in a variety of samples. The linear regressions are for the equation log yi equals mu plus alpha ri plus xi gamma plus epsilon I, where yi is income per capita in country I, ri is the protection against expropriation measure, xi is a vector of other covariates, and epsilon I is a random error term. The coefficient of interest throughout the paper is alpha, the effect of institutions on income per capita. Column 1 shows that in the whole world sample there is a strong correlation between our measure of institutions and income per capita. Column 2 shows that the impact of the institutions variable on income per capita in our base sample is quite similar to that in the whole world, and figure 2 shows this relationship diagrammatically for our base sample consisting of 64 countries. The R² of the regression in column 1 indicates that over 50% of the variation in income per capita is associated with variation in this index of institutions. To get a sense of the magnitude of the effect of institutions on performance, let us compare 2 countries, Nigeria, which has approximately the 25th percentile of the institutional measure in this sample, 5.6, and Chile, which has approximately the 75th percentile of the institutions index, 7.8. The estimate in column 1, 0.52, indicates that there should be on average a 1.14 log point difference between the log GDPs of the corresponding countries, or, approximately, a 2-fold difference e to the power of 1.14 to 12.1. In practice, this GDP gap is 253 log points, approximately 11-fold. Therefore, if the effect estimated in Table 2 were causal, it would imply a fairly large effect of institutions on performance, but still much less than the actual income gap between Nigeria and Chile. Many social scientists, including Montesquieu, Diamond, and Sachs and co-authors, have argued for a direct effect of climate on performance, and Gallup et al. And Hall and Jones document the correlation between distance from the equator and economic performance. To control for this, in columns 3 to 6, we add latitude as a regressor. We follow the literature in using the absolute value measure of latitude, that is, distance from the equator, scaled between 0 and 1. This changes the coefficient of the index of institutions little. Latitude itself is also significant and has the sign found by the previous studies. In columns 4 and 6, we also add dummies for Africa, Asia, and other continents, with America as the omitted group. Although protection against expropriation risk remains significant, the continent dummies are also statistically and quantitatively significant. The Africa dummy in column 6 indicates that in our sample African countries are 90 log points, that is, approximately 145% poorer even after taking the effective institutions into account. Finally, in columns 7 and 8, we repeat our basic regressions using the log of output per worker from Hall and Jones, with very similar results. Overall, the results in Table 2 show a strong correlation between institutions and economic performance. Nevertheless, there are a number of important reasons for not interpreting this relationship as causal. First, rich economies may be able to afford, or perhaps prefer, better institutions. Arguably more important than this reverse causality problem, there are many omitted determinants of income differences that will naturally be correlated with institutions. Finally, the measures of institutions are constructed ex post, and the analysts may have had a natural bias in seeing better institutions in richer places. As well as these problems introducing positive bias in the OLS estimates, the fact that the institutions variable is measured with considerable error and corresponds poorly to the cluster of institutions that matter in practice creates attenuation and may bias the OLS estimates downwards. All of these problems could be solved if we had an instrument for institutions. Such an instrument must be an important factor in accounting for the institutional variation that we observe, but have no direct effect on performance. Our discussion in Section 1 suggests that settler mortality during the time of colonization is a plausible instrument. Section 3. Mortality of early settlers. Subsection A. Sources of European mortality in the colonies. In this subsection, we give a brief overview of the sources of mortality facing potential settlers. Malaria and yellow fever were the major sources of European mortality in the colonies. In the tropics, these two diseases accounted for 80% of European deaths, while gastrointestinal diseases accounted for another 15%. Throughout the 19th century, areas without malaria and yellow fever, such as New Zealand, were healthier than Europe because the major causes of death in Europe, that is, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and smallpox, were rare in these places. Both malaria and yellow fever are transmitted by mosquito vectors. In the case of malaria, the main transmitter is the Anopheles gambiae complex and the mosquito Anopheles funestus, while the main carrier of yellow fever is Aedes aegypti. Both malaria and yellow fever vectors tend to live close to human habitation. In places where the malaria vector is present, such as the West African savanna or forest, an individual can get as many as several hundred infectious mosquito bites a year. For a person without immunity, malaria, particularly Plasmodium falciparum, is often fatal, so Europeans in Africa, India, or the Caribbean faced very high death rates. In contrast, death rates for the adult local population were much lower. Curtin describes this as follows. Children in West Africa would be infected with malaria parasites shortly after birth and were frequently reinfected afterwards. If they lived beyond the age of about 5, they acquired an apparent immunity. The parasite remained with them, normally in the liver, but clinical symptoms were rare so long as they continued to be infected with the same species of P. falciparum. The more recent books on malariology confirm this conclusion. For example, in stable endemic areas a heavy toll of morbidity and mortality falls on young children, but malaria is a relatively mild condition in adults. Similarly, the World Health Organization points out that in endemic malaria areas of Africa and the Western Pacific today the risk of malaria severity and death is almost exclusively limited to non-immunis, being most serious for young children over 6 months of age. Surviving children develop their own immunity between the age of 3 to 5 years. People in areas where malaria is endemic are also more likely to have genetic immunity against malaria. For example, they tend to have the sickle cell trait, which discourages the multiplication of parasites in the blood, or deficiencies in glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase and thalassemia traits, which also protect against malaria. Porter writes, in such a process, close to 100% of Africans acquired a genetic trait that protects them against vivax malaria and probably against falciparum malaria as well. Overall, the WHO estimates that malaria kills about 1 million people per year, most of them children. It does not, however, generally kill adults who grew up in malaria endemic areas. Although yellow fever's epidemiology is quite different from malaria, it was also much more fatal to Europeans than to non-Europeans who grew up in areas where yellow fever commonly occurred. yellow fever leaves its surviving victims with a lifelong immunity, which also explains its epidemic pattern, relying on a concentrated non-immune population. Curtin writes, because most Africans had passed through a light case early in life, yellow fever in West Africa was a stranger's disease, attacking those who grew up elsewhere. Similarly, Michael B. Oldstone writes, most Black Africans and their descendants respond to yellow fever infection with mild to moderate symptoms such as headache, fever, nausea, and vomiting, and then recover in a few days. This outcome reflects the long relationship between the virus and its indigenous hosts, who through generations of exposure to the virus have evolved resistance. In contrast, fatality rates among non-immune adults, such as Europeans, could be as high as 90%. Advances in medical science have reduced the danger posed by malaria and yellow fever. Yellow fever is mostly eradicated, and malaria has been eradicated in many areas. Europeans developed methods of dealing with these diseases that gradually became more effective in the second half of the 19th century. For example, they came to understand that high doses of quinine, derived from the cinchona bark, acted as a prophylactic and prevented infection or reduced the severity of malaria. They also started to undertake serious mosquito eradication efforts and protect themselves against mosquito bites. Further, Europeans also learned that an often effective method of reducing mortality from yellow fever is flight from the area, since the transmitter mosquito, Aedes aegypti, has only a short range. Nevertheless, during much of the 19th century, there was almost a complete misunderstanding of the nature of both diseases. For example, the leading theory for malaria was that it was caused by miasma from swamps, and quinine was not used widely. The role of small collections of water to breed mosquitoes and transmit these diseases was not understood. It was only in the late 19th century that Europeans started to control these diseases. These considerations, together with the data we have on the mortality of local people and population densities before the arrival of Europeans, make us believe that settler mortality is a plausible instrument for institutional development. These diseases affected European settlement patterns and the type of institutions they set up, but had little effect on the health and economy of indigenous people. A final noteworthy feature, helpful in interpreting our results below, is that malaria prevalence depends as much on the microclimate of an area as on its temperature and humidity, or on whether it is in the tropics. High altitudes reduce the risk of infection, so in areas of high altitude, where hill stations could be set up, such as Bogotá in Colombia, mortality rates were typically lower than in wet coastal areas. However, malaria could sometimes be more serious in high altitude areas. For example, Curtin points out that in Ceylon mortality was lower in the coast than the highlands because rains in the coast washed away the larvae of the transmitter mosquitoes. Similarly, in Madras many coastal regions were free of malaria, while northern India had high rates of infection. Curtin also illustrates how there were marked differences in the prevalence of malaria within small regions of Madagascar. This suggests that mortality rates faced by Europeans are unlikely to be a proxy for some simple geographic or climatic feature of the country. Subsection B. Data on potential settler mortality. Our data on the mortality of European settlers come largely from the work of Philip Curtin. Systematic military medical record keeping began only after 1815, as an attempt to understand why so many soldiers were dying in some places. The first detailed studies were retrospective and dealt with British forces between 1817 and 1836. The United States and French governments quickly adopted similar methods. Some early data are also available for the Dutch East Indies. By the 1870s, most European countries published regular reports on the health of their soldiers. The standard measure is annualized deaths per thousand mean strength. This measure reports the death rate among 1,000 soldiers where each death is replaced with a new soldier. Curtin reviews in detail the construction of these estimates for particular places and campaigns, and assesses which data should be considered reliable. Curtin's Death by Migration, 1989, deals primarily with the mortality of European troops from 1817 to 1848. At this time, modern medicine was still in its infancy, and the European militaries did not yet understand how to control malaria and yellow fever. These mortality rates can therefore be interpreted as reasonable estimates of settler mortality. They are consistent with substantial evidence from other sources. Curtin's Disease and Empire, 1998, adds similar data on the mortality of soldiers in the second half of the 19th century. In all cases, we use the earliest available number for each country, reasoning that this is the best estimate of the mortality rates that settlers would have faced, at least until the 20th century. The main gap in the Curtin data is for South America, since the Spanish and Portuguese militaries did not keep good records of mortality. Hector Gutierrez used Vatican records to construct estimates for the mortality rates of bishops in Latin America from 1604 to 1876. Because these data overlap with the Curtin estimates for several countries, we are able to construct a data series for South America. Curtin also provides estimates of mortality in naval squadrons for different regions, which we can use to generate alternative estimates of mortality in South America. Section 4. Institutions and performance. 4 results. Subsection A. Determinants of current institutions. Equation 1 describes the relationship between current institutions and log GDP. In addition, we have Equation 2. Ri equals lambda r plus beta rci plus xi gamma r plus nu ri. Equation 3. Ci equals lambda c plus beta csi plus xi gamma c plus nu ci. Equation 4. Si equals lambda s plus beta s log mi plus xi gamma s plus nu si. Where R is the measure of current institutions, protection against expropriation between 1985 and 1995. C is our measure of early institutions circa 1900. S is the measure of European settlements in the colony by fraction of the population with European descent in 1900. And M is mortality rates faced by settlers. X is a vector of covariates that affect all variables. The simplest identification strategy might be to use SI, or CI, as an instrument for RI in equation 1, and we report some of these regressions in table 8. However, to the extent that settlers are more likely to migrate to richer areas and early institutions reflect other characteristics that are important for income today, this identification strategy would be invalid, that is, CI and SI could be correlated with epsilon I. Instead, we use the mortality rates faced by the settlers, log mi, as an instrument for RI. This identification strategy will be valid as long as log mi is uncorrelated with epsilon I, that is, if mortality rates of settlers between the 17th and 19th centuries have no effect on income today other than through their influence on institutional development. We argued above that this exclusion restriction is plausible. Figure 3 illustrates the relationship between the potential settler mortality rates and the index of institutions. We use the logarithm of the settler mortality rates, since there are no theoretical reasons to prefer the level as a determinant of institutions rather than the log, and using the log ensures that the extreme African mortality rates do not play a disproportionate role. As it happens, there is an almost linear relationship between the log settler mortality and our measure of institutions. This relationship shows that ex-colonies where Europeans faced higher mortality rates have substantially worse institutions today. In Table 3, we document that this relationship works through the channels hypothesized in Section I. In particular, we present OLS regressions of equations 2, 3, and 4. In the top panel, we regress the protection against expropriation variable on the other variables. Column 1 uses constraints faced by the executive in 1900 as the regressor, and shows a close association between early institutions and institutions today. For example, past institutions alone explain 20% of the variation in the index of current institutions. The second column adds the latitude variable, with little effect on the estimate. Columns 3 and 4 use the democracy index, and confirm the results in columns 1 and 2. Both constraints on the executive and democracy indices assign low scores to countries that were colonies in 1900, and do not use the earliest post-independence information for Latin American countries and the Neo-Europes. In columns 5 and 6, we adopt an alternative approach and use the constraints on the executive in the first year of independence and also control separately for time since independence. The results are similar, and indicate that early institutions tend to persist. Columns 7 and 8 show the association between protection against expropriation and European settlements. The fraction of Europeans in 1900 alone explains approximately 30% of the variation in our institutions variable today. Columns 9 and 10 show the relationship between the protection against expropriation variable and the mortality rates faced by settlers. This specification will be the first stage for our main two-stage least squares estimates, that is, 2SLS. It shows that settler mortality alone explains 27% of the differences in institutions we observe today. Panel B of Table 3 provides evidence in support of the hypothesis that early institutions were shaped, at least in part, by settlements, and that settlements were affected by mortality. Columns 1 to 2 and 5 to 6 relate our measure of constraint on the executive and democracy in 1900 to the measure of European settlements in 1900, by fraction of the population of European descent. Columns 3 to 4 and 7 to 8 relate the same variables to settler mortality. These regressions show that settlement patterns explain around 50% of the variation in early institutions. Finally, columns 9 and 10 show the relationship between settlements and mortality rates. Subsection B. Institutions and economic performance. Two-stage least squares estimates of equation 1 are presented in Table 4. Protection against expropriation variable, RI, is treated as endogenous, and modeled as equation 5. RI equals zeta plus beta log mi plus xi delta plus nu I, where mi is the settler mortality rate in 1000 mean strength. The exclusion restriction is that this variable does not appear in equation 1. Panel A of Table 4 reports two SLS estimates of the coefficient of interest, alpha from equation 1, and Panel B gives the corresponding first stages. Column 1 displays the strong first stage relationship between settler mortality and current institutions in our base sample, also shown in Table 3. The corresponding 2 SLS estimate of the impact of institutions on income per capita is 0.94. This estimate is highly significant with a standard error of 0.16, and in fact larger than the OLS estimates reported in Table 2. This suggests that measurement error in the institution's variables that creates attenuation bias is likely to be more important than reverse causality and omitted variables biases. Here we are referring to measurement error broadly construed. In reality, the set of institutions that matter for economic performance is very complex, and any single measure is bound to capture only part of the true institutions, creating a typical measurement error problem. Moreover, what matters for current income is presumably not only institutions today, but also institutions in the past. Our measure of institutions, which refers to 1985 to 1995, will not be perfectly correlated with these. Does the 2 SLS estimate make quantitative sense? Does it imply that institutional differences can explain a significant fraction of income differences across countries? Let us once again compare two typical countries with high and low expropriation risk, Nigeria and Chile. These countries are typical for the 4 regression, in the sense that they are practically on the regression line. Our 2 SLS estimate, 0.94, implies that the 2.24 differences in expropriation risk between these two countries should translate into 206 log point, approximately 7-fold difference. In practice, the presence of measurement error complicates this interpretation, because some of the difference between Nigeria and Chile's expropriation index may reflect measurement error. Therefore, the 7-fold difference is an upper bound. In any case, the estimates in Table 4 imply a substantial, but not implausibly large, effective institutional differences on income per capita. Column 2 shows that adding latitude does not change the relationship. The institution's coefficient is now 1.00 with a standard error of 0.22. Remarkably, the latitude variable now has the wrong sign and is insignificant. This result suggests that many previous studies may have found latitude to be a significant determinant of economic performance because it is correlated with institutions, or with the exogenous component of institutions caused by early colonial experience. Columns 3 and 4 document that our results are not driven by the neo-Europes. When we exclude the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the estimates remain highly significant, and in fact increase a little. For example, the coefficient for institutions is now 1.28 without the latitude control, and 1.21 when we control for latitude. Columns 5 and 6 show that our results are also robust to dropping all the African countries from our sample. The estimates without Africa are somewhat smaller, but also more precise. For example, the coefficient for institutions is 0.58 without the latitude control, and still 0.58 when we control for latitude. In columns 7 and 8, we add continent dummies to the regressions, for Africa, Asia, and other, with America as the omitted group. The addition of these dummies does not change the estimated effective institutions, and the dummies are jointly insignificant at the 5% level, though the dummy for Asia is significantly different from that of America. The fact that the African dummy is insignificant suggests that the reason why African countries are poorer is not due to cultural or geographic factors, but mostly accounted for by the existence of worse institutions in Africa. Finally, in column 9, we repeat our basic regression using log of output per worker as calculated by Hall and Jones in 1999. The result is very close to our baseline result. The 2 SLS coefficient is 0.98 instead of 0.94, as in column 1. This shows that whether we use income per capita or output per worker has little effect on our results. Overall, the results in Table 4 show a large effect of institutions on economic performance. In the rest of the paper, we investigate the robustness of these results. Section 5. Robustness. Subsection A. Additional controls. The validity of our 2 SLS results in Table 4 depends on the assumption that settler mortality in the past has no direct effect on current economic performance. Although this presumption appears reasonable, here we substantiate it further by directly controlling for many of the variables that could plausibly be correlated with both settler mortality and economic outcomes, and checking whether the addition of these variables affects our estimates. Overall, we find that our results change remarkably little with the inclusion of these variables, and many variables emphasized in previous work become insignificant once the effect of institutions is controlled for. La Porta et al. Argue for the importance of colonial origin, that is, identity of the main colonizing country, as a determinant of current institutions. The identity of the colonial power could also matter because it might have an effect through culture, as argued by David Landis. In columns 1 and 2 of Table 5, we had dummies for British and French colonies. Colonies of other nations are the omitted group. This has little effect on our results. Moreover, the French dummy in the first stage is estimated to be 0, while the British dummy is positive, and marginally significant. Therefore, as suggested by La Porta et al., British colonies appear to have better institutions, but this effect is much smaller and weaker than in a specification that does not control for the effect of settler mortality on institutional development. Therefore, it appears that British colonies are found to perform substantially better in other studies in large part because Britain colonized places where settlements were possible, and this made British colonies inherit better institutions. To further investigate this issue, columns 3 and 4 estimate our basic regression for British colonies only. They show that both the relationship between settler mortality and institutions and that between institutions and income in this sample of 25 British colonies are very similar to those in our base sample. For example, the 2 SLS estimate of the effect of institutions on income is now 1.07 without controlling for latitude and 1.00 with latitude. These results suggest that the identity of the colonizer is not an important determinant of colonization patterns and subsequent institutional development. Von Hayek and La Porta et al. Also emphasize the importance of legal origin. In columns 5 and 6, we control for legal origin. In our sample, all countries have either French or British legal origins, so we simply add a dummy for French legal origin. Many countries that are not French colonies nonetheless have French legal origin. Our estimate of the effect of institutions on income per capita is unaffected. An argument dating back to Max Weber views religion as a key determinant of economic performance. To control for this, in columns 7 and 8, we add the fraction of the populations that are Catholic, Muslim, and of other religions, with Protestants as the omitted group. In the table we report the joint significance level, that is, the p-value, of the corresponding F statistic for these dummies, as well as the 2 SLS estimate of the effect of institutions. Finally, column 9 adds all the variables in this table simultaneously. Again, these controls have very little effect on our main estimate. Another concern is that settler mortality is correlated with climate and other geographic characteristics. Our instrument may therefore be picking up the direct effect of these variables. We investigate this issue in Table 6. In columns 1 and 2, we add a set of temperature and humidity variables. In the table we report joint significance levels for these variables. Again, they have little effect on our estimates. A related concern is that in colonies where Europeans settled, the current population consists of a higher fraction of Europeans. One might be worried that we are capturing the direct effect of having more Europeans, who, perhaps, brought a European culture or special relations with Europe. To control for this, we add the fraction of the population of European descent in columns 3 and 4 of Table 6. This variable is insignificant, while the effect of institutions remains highly significant, with a coefficient of 0.96. In columns 5 and 6, we control for measures of natural resources, soil quality and practice soil types, and for whether the country is landlocked. All these controls are insignificant, and have little effect on our 2 SLS estimate of the effect of institutions on income per capita. In columns 7 and 8, we include ethnolinguistic fragmentation as another control and treat it as exogenous. Now the coefficient of protection against expropriation is 0.74, which is only slightly smaller than our baseline estimate. In Appendix A, we show that the inclusion of an endogenous variable positively correlated with income or institutions will bias the coefficient on institutions downwards. Since ethnolinguistic fragmentation is likely to be endogenous with respect to development, that is, ethnolinguistic fragmentation tends to disappear after the formation of centralized markets, and is correlated with settler mortality, the estimate of 0.74 likely understates the effect of institutions on income. In column 9 of Table 6, we include all these variables together. Despite the large number of controls, protection against expropriation on income per capita is still highly significant, with a somewhat smaller coefficient of 0.71, which is again likely to understate the effect of institutions on income because ethnolinguistic fragmentation is treated as exogenous. Finally, In Table 7, we investigate whether our instrument could be capturing the general effect of disease on development. Sachs and a series of co-authors have argued for the importance of malaria and other diseases in explaining African poverty. Since malaria was one of the main causes of settler mortality, our estimate may be capturing the direct effect of malaria on economic performance. We are skeptical of this argument since malaria prevalence is highly endogenous. It is the poorer countries with worse institutions that have been unable to eradicate malaria. While Sachs and co-authors argue that malaria reduces output through poor health, high mortality, and absenteeism, most people who live in high malaria areas have developed some immunity to the disease. Malaria should therefore have little direct effect on economic performance, though, obviously, it will have very high social costs. In contrast, for Europeans, or anyone else who has not been exposed to malaria as a young child, malaria is usually fatal, making malaria prevalence a key determinant of European settlements and institutional development. In any case, controlling for malaria does not change our results. We do this in columns 1 and 2 by controlling for the fraction of the population who live in an area where falciparum malaria is endemic in 1994. Since malaria prevalence in 1994 is highly endogenous, the argument in Appendix A implies that controlling for it directly will underestimate the effect of institutions on performance. In fact, the coefficient on protection against expropriation is now estimated to be somewhat smaller, 0.69 instead of 0.94 as in Table 4. Nevertheless, the effect remains highly significant with a standard error of 0.25, while malaria itself is insignificant. In a comment on the working paper version of our study, John W. MacArthur and Sachs discuss the role of geography and institutions in determining economic performance. They accept our case for the importance of institutions, but argue that more general specifications show that the disease environment and health characteristics of countries, that is, their geography, matter for economic performance. In particular, they extend our work by controlling for life expectancy and infant mortality, and they also instrument for these health variables using geographic variables such as latitude and mean temperature. Table 7 also expands upon the specifications that MacArthur and Sachs suggest. Columns 3 to 6 include life expectancy and infant mortality as exogenous controls. The estimates show a significant effect of institutions on income, similar to, but smaller than, our baseline estimates. Infant mortality is also marginally significant. Since health is highly endogenous, the coefficient on these variables will be biased up, while the coefficient of institutions will be biased down. These estimates are therefore consistent with institutions being the major determinant of income per capita differences, with little effect from geography/health variables. Columns 7 to 9 report estimates from models that treat both health and institutions as endogenous, and following MacArthur and Sachs, instrument for them using latitude, mean temperature, and distance from the coast as instruments in addition to our instrument, settler mortality. MacArthur and Sachs report that in these regressions the institution variable is still significant, but geography/health are also significant. In contrast to MacArthur and Sachs results, we find that only institutions are significant. This difference is due to the fact that MacArthur and Sachs include Britain and France in their sample. Britain and France are not in our sample, which consists of only ex-colonies. There is no reason for variation in the mortality rates of British and French troops at home to be related to their institutional development. It turns out that once Britain and France are left out, the MacArthur and Sachs specification generates no evidence that geography/health variables have an important effect on economic performance. As a final strategy to see whether settler mortality could be proxying for the current disease environment, we estimated models using a yellow fever instrument. This is a dummy variable indicating whether the area was ever affected by yellow fever. This is an attractive alternative strategy because yellow fever is mostly eradicated today, so this dummy should not be correlated with the current disease environment. The disadvantage of this approach is that there is less variation in this instrument than our settler mortality variable. Despite this, the yellow fever results, reported in columns 10 and 11 of Table 7, are encouraging. The estimate in our base sample is 0.91 comparable to our baseline estimate of 0.95 reported in Table 4. Adding continent dummies in column 11 reduces this estimate slightly to 0.90. Subsection B. Over-identification tests. We can also investigate the validity of our approach by using over-identification tests. According to our theory, settler mortality M, affected settlements S, settlements affected early institutions C, and early institutions affected current institutions R. Compare equations 2, 3, and 4. We can test whether any of these variables, C, S, and M, has a direct effect on income per capita, log Y, by using measures of C and S as additional instruments. The over-identification test presumes that one of these instruments, say S, is truly exogenous, and tests for the exogeneity of the others, such as settler mortality. This approach is useful since it is a direct test of our exclusion restriction. However, such tests may not lead to a rejection if all instruments are invalid, but still highly correlated with each other. Therefore, the results have to be interpreted with caution. Overall, the over-identification test will reject the validity of our approach if either I, the equation of interest, 1, does not have a constant coefficient, that is, log yi equals mu plus airi plus epsilon I, where I denotes country, or C or S has a direct effect on income per capita, log yi, that is, either S or C is correlated with epsilon I, or settler mortality M has an effect on log yi that works through another variable, such as culture. The data support the over-identifying restrictions implied by our approach. This implies that, subject to the usual problems of power associated with over-identification tests, we can rule out all three of the above possibilities. This gives us additional confidence that settler mortality is a valid instrument and that we are estimating the effect of institutions on current performance with our instrumental variable strategy, that is, not capturing the effect of omitted variables. The results of the over-identification tests, and related results, are reported in Table 8. In the top panel, Panel A, we report the two SLS estimates of the effect of protection against expropriation on GDP per capita using a variety of instruments other than mortality rates, while Panel B gives the corresponding first stages. These estimates are always quite close to those reported in Table 4. For example, in Column 1, we use European settlements in 1900 as the only instrument for institutions. This results in an estimated effect of 0.87, with standard error 0.14. as compared to our baseline estimate of 0.94. The other columns add latitude, and use other instruments such as constraint on the executive in 1900 and in the first year of independence, and democracy in 1900. Panel D reports an easy-to-interpret version of the over-identification test. It adds the log of mortality as an exogenous regressor. If mortality rates faced by settlers had a direct effect on income per capita, we would expect this variable to come in negative and significant. In all cases, it is small and statistically insignificant. For example, in Column 1, log mortality has a coefficient of 20.07, with standard error 0.17. This confirms that the impact of mortality rates faced by settlers likely works through their effect on institutions. Finally, for completeness, in Panel C we report the p-value from the appropriate Chi-2 over-identification test. This tests whether the two SLS coefficients estimated with the instruments indicated in Panels A and B versus the coefficients estimated using settler mortality in addition to the true instruments are significantly different. For example, in the first column, the coefficient using European settlements alone is compared to the estimate using European settlements and log mortality as instruments. We never reject the hypothesis that they are equal at the 5% significance level. So these results also show no evidence that mortality rates faced by settlers have a direct effect on income per capita, or an effect working through a variable other than institutions. Section 6. Concluding remarks. Many economists and social scientists believe that differences in institutions and state policies are at the root of large differences in income per capita across countries. There is little agreement, however, about what determines institutions and government attitudes towards economic progress, making it difficult to isolate exogenous sources of variation in institutions to estimate their effect on performance. In this paper, we argued that differences in colonial experience could be a source of exogenous differences in institutions. Our argument rests on the following premises. 1. Europeans adopted very different colonization strategies, with different associated institutions. In one extreme, as in the case of the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, they went and settled in the colonies and set up institutions that enforced the rule of law and encouraged investment. In the other extreme, as in the Congo or the Gold Coast, they set up extractive states with the intention of transferring resources rapidly to the metropole. These institutions were detrimental to investment and economic progress. 2. The colonization strategy was in part determined by the feasibility of European settlement. In places where Europeans faced very high mortality rates, they could not go and settle, and they were more likely to set up extractive states. 3. Finally, we argue that these early institutions persisted to the present. Determinants of whether Europeans could go and settle in the colonies, therefore, have an important effect on institutions today. We exploit these differences as a source of exogenous variation to estimate the impact of institutions on economic performance. There is a high correlation between mortality rates faced by soldiers, bishops, and sailors in the colonies and European settlements, between European settlements and early measures of institutions, and between early institutions and institutions today. We estimate large effects of institutions on income per capita using this source of variation. We also document that this relationship is not driven by outliers, and is robust to controlling for latitude, climate, current disease environment, religion, natural resources, soil quality, ethno-linguistic fragmentation, and current racial composition. It is useful to point out that our findings do not imply that institutions today are predetermined by colonial policies and cannot be changed. We emphasize colonial experience as one of the many factors affecting institutions. Since mortality rates faced by settlers are arguably exogenous, they are useful as an instrument to isolate the effect of institutions on performance. In fact, our reading is that these results suggest substantial economic gains from improving institutions, for example as in the case of Japan during the Meiji Restoration or South Korea during the 1960s. There are many questions that our analysis does not address. Institutions are treated largely as a black box. The results indicate that reducing expropriation risk, or improving other aspects of the cluster of institutions, would result in significant gains in income per capita, but do not point out what concrete steps would lead to an improvement in these institutions. Institutional features, such as expropriation risk, property rights enforcement, or rule of law, should probably be interpreted as an equilibrium outcome, related to some more fundamental institutions, for example, presidential versus parliamentary system, which can be changed directly. A more detailed analysis of the effect of more fundamental institutions on property rights and expropriation risk is an important area for future study. The end.